New York, 1980. A neighborhood marked by violence, where the law of the streets held more weight than any written law. Amid the countless untold stories, there is one that remains too heavy to forget. A story of vengeance, honor, and courage, where the Jenkins brothers decided that the only way to settle a conflict was through brutal violence. What started as a street brawl quickly escalated into something much more, leading to the execution of 12 men. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. In the late summer of 1980, the streets of New York were far from peaceful. The city's pulse was dictated by the clamor of the city's neighborhoods, from the hustle of Wall Street to the grittiness of Brooklyn. But it was in the rough, untamed streets of the Bronx where the Jenkins brothers carved out their own reputation. The Jenkins family wasn't wealthy, but they were well known, not just for their presence, but for their code of honor that ran deeper than any legal system. The Jenkins family was made up of 3 brothers: Tommy, the oldest at 32, a quiet, brooding man who spoke only when necessary; Greg, 29, the impulsive one, quick with a joke but quicker with his fists; and Derek, the youngest at 24, who followed his brothers closely, eager to prove himself. They lived by one simple rule: respect the code or face the consequences. They had grown up in the neighborhood, watching the cycles of violence and lawlessness, where every interaction could lead to a fight, and every fight could escalate into something deadly. The Jenkins brothers were tough, their hands hardened by years of work, their hearts tempered by the harshness of life. They had seen their fair share of street brawls, and they knew how to survive in a world where trust was rare and betrayal came easy. It was the summer of 1980 when everything changed. The night that would haunt New York's streets for years to come started like any other. The 3 brothers were walking home from a small neighborhood bar, their laughter echoing through the empty streets. They weren't looking for trouble, but trouble always seemed to find them. It was then that they encountered a group of men from the other side of the tracks, known thugs who ran a local extortion racket. They were loud, disrespectful, and looking for a fight. The Jenkins brothers had lived through worse, but on this night, something was different. A comment made by one of the thugs escalated the situation quickly. Derek, the youngest, had always been the most hot-headed, and when one of the thugs made an offhand remark about his mother, Derek saw red. Without thinking, he lunged forward, throwing a punch that landed squarely on the thug's jaw. What followed was chaos. A full-blown street brawl erupted with punches flying from every direction. Tommy, Greg, and Derek fought back fiercely, their fists landing with precision and power. They were outnumbered, but they were skilled. The thugs, however, weren't interested in fighting fair. They pulled knives from their jackets, brandishing them in the darkness. Blood began to spill, but the Jenkins brothers weren't backing down. They were determined to protect each other no matter the cost. The fight seemed endless, the sound of fists against flesh, the shuffle of feet on concrete, the growls of anger filling the night air. But then, in a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, Tommy made a decision. He pulled Derek back and yelled at Greg to stop. The thugs had their knives out, but the brothers had their pride. "We don't kill over a street fight," Tommy said, his voice calm but firm. "Get out. This ends now." The thugs hesitated, but only for a moment. With a roar, one of them lunged at Tommy, knife raised. Without thinking, Tommy grabbed a nearby pipe, swinging it with deadly force. It struck the thug in the side of the head, knocking him out cold. The remaining thugs, realizing they were outmatched, scattered into the night, leaving behind their injured comrades. But the fight wasn't over. No, the fight had just begun. As the brothers stood over the bodies of the thugs they had just fought off, they knew one thing: this wouldn't be the last time they saw those men. The streets of New York had a way of turning things around, and this was just the beginning of a blood-stained path that would lead them to something far worse. For the Jenkins brothers, honor was everything. And when the thugs returned the next day, guns in hand, seeking revenge, they knew they were ready to stand their ground. The code had been broken, and now there would be consequences. The law was powerless in a situation like this. The Jenkins brothers would have to decide what kind of men they wanted to be in a city where survival was all that mattered. The choice they would make would lead to one of the most brutal conflicts the streets of New York had ever seen. The next morning, the sun hung low over the Bronx, casting long shadows down the cracked sidewalks. The night before, the Jenkins brothers had walked away from a bloody confrontation, their bodies bruised and their knuckles swollen. But they'd survived. Yet the price for that survival was yet to come. Tommy sat on the stoop of the small row house he called home, nursing his hands with a rag soaked in cold water. Greg and Derek were inside, pacing back and forth. They had come home with one thing on their minds: revenge. The thugs wouldn't forget what happened last night, and the Jenkins brothers knew it. What they didn't know was how far the other side would go to reclaim their pride. "You think they'll just let us walk away?" Greg asked, his voice harsh with anger. He had always been the one to want to settle things quickly, to throw a punch and move on, but this situation felt different. The thugs had been humiliated, and that didn't sit well with people like them. "They'll come back, we know that," Tommy replied, his voice steady as he looked down at his hands. His mind was racing, the same thought running through it over and over again. They needed to be ready. There was no going back now. Derek, the youngest, stood by the window, peering out at the street. "I don't want to wait for them to come to us," he said, his fists clenched. "Let's go find them. We'll finish it now." Tommy shook his head. "That's not how we do things. We wait. We wait for them to make their move." But Derek wasn't satisfied. "You know they'll come for us. They'll do it on their terms. We should make sure they know not to mess with us again." Tommy stood up slowly, his body aching, but his mind clear. He placed a firm hand on Derek's shoulder. "We fight when it's right to fight, not when we're angry. We don't lower ourselves to their level. We stick to the code." The code was simple, and it was everything to the Jenkins brothers. It was a way of life, a set of rules they followed that governed their actions, the choices they made, and the way they interacted with the world. But in New York, in the streets, the line between honor and chaos was razor thin, and it didn't take much for that line to be crossed. Greg wasn't convinced. "Code or no code, those guys are going to come for us. You don't humiliate people like that and walk away unscathed." "We'll be ready when they come," Tommy said. Until then, we lay low. The next few days were tense. The Jenkins brothers stuck to their routine, but the weight of what was coming hung over them like a storm cloud. Tommy made sure to keep a low profile, avoiding unnecessary attention. Greg, however, kept his ear to the ground, looking for any word about the thugs who had attacked them. Derek, as restless as ever, spent his time in the gym, working on his strength, ready for whatever might come next. But then it happened. On the fourth day after the fight, word came that the thugs had returned. Not just any return, but a return with a vengeance. They had come armed, bringing their friends along with them. The word was clear. The Jenkins brothers were going to pay. Tommy wasn't surprised. In the world they lived in, retaliation was inevitable. The streets had a language all their own, and everyone understood it. You either stood your ground, or you were swept away. The night was setting in when the first car rolled down their street, headlights cutting through the darkness. Tommy, Greg, and Derek were ready. They had been expecting this, but the question that lingered in the air was, how far would they go? How far would the thugs push them? Tommy's hands were steady as he grabbed the pistol tucked in the waistband of his jeans. He looked at Greg and Derek, who nodded back at him. They didn't need to say anything. They knew what had to be done. The thugs pulled up, their car skidding to a stop in front of the Jenkins house. They were ready for this fight. But the Jenkins brothers weren't going to give them the satisfaction of an easy victory. The thugs stepped out, 7 of them, all armed, all ready for blood. The night was still, the only sound the hum of the city in the distance. The Jenkins brothers stood in the doorway, a wall of muscle and fury, waiting. Tommy stepped forward, his face calm but his eyes burning with the fire of a man who had been pushed too far. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low, controlled. One of the thugs, the same man who had started the fight a few days ago, sneered at Tommy. "You think you can walk away from this, Jenkins? We're taking you down one way or another." With a swift motion, Tommy pulled out the pistol. "This isn't how it works," he said. "You've crossed the line." Before anyone could react, Greg and Derek rushed forward, tackling two of the thugs, fists flying, the sounds of violence breaking the stillness of the night. Tommy stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. It was do or die. The battle had begun. The street erupted in chaos as the Jenkins brothers clashed with the thugs, the air thick with the sound of fists connecting with flesh, the grunts of struggle, and the occasional shout that echoed off the neighboring buildings. Tommy, Greg, and Derek were outnumbered, but they fought like men who had nothing left to lose, like men who knew that survival in their world meant crossing lines that others wouldn't dare approach. Tommy's focus was sharp. The thug in front of him was bigger, but Tommy had the advantage of years spent in the unforgiving streets of New York, where every fight was a battle for survival. With a quick sidestep, he avoided the thug's wild swing and landed a blow square to his opponent's jaw. The thug stumbled back, caught off guard by Tommy's precision. Behind him, Greg was in his element. His fists were fast and relentless, each punch landing with the kind of force that spoke of years of practice in street brawls. He moved with calculated aggression, knowing that in moments like these, hesitation could get you killed. He sent one of the thugs crashing to the ground with a hard right hook, but there were still more of them, more threats pressing in. Derek, the youngest, had been waiting for this moment. His adrenaline surged as he engaged with two of the thugs at once, his body a blur of rapid movements. His youth gave him the edge of speed and agility, and he used it to his advantage, landing punch after punch, backing his enemies into the corner of the street. But as the fight wore on, it became clear that the Jenkins brothers were starting to tire. The thugs, though outnumbered, had their own brutality, their own street fighting experience. And as much as the brothers were holding their ground, they couldn't ignore the harsh reality. This was a fight they might not walk away from unscathed. Tommy had always believed that there was a certain honor in street fighting, a code that dictated when you fought and when you walked away. But there was no honor here. This wasn't a simple street brawl. It was a war that had started with a simple disrespect, and now it was about to end in bloodshed. The thug leader, the one who had first laid hands on Tommy days earlier, saw his opportunity. As Tommy turned to check on his brothers, the thug lunged, swinging a crowbar at his head. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Tommy stumbled, his vision blurring, his legs weakening. Greg and Derek, seeing their brother in danger, rushed to help, but the thug leader was already pulling out a knife, slashing in all directions to keep them at bay. Derek barely avoided the blade, but Greg wasn't so lucky. He took a shallow cut along his side, a line of blood quickly staining his shirt. "Stay back," the thug leader shouted, his eyes wild with rage. "This is between us." Tommy's head was spinning, but the fire inside him was still burning. He staggered to his feet, shaking off the dizziness, and pulled out the pistol from his waistband. His breath came in ragged gasps as he aimed at the thug leader, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You think you can take us down like this?" Tommy growled. "You don't know who you're messing with." For a moment, everything stood still. The thugs, bloodied and bruised, stared at the pistol, knowing that it was their last warning. Tommy wasn't bluffing. They had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. It was either kill or be killed. The thug leader's eyes flickered with doubt, but then something shifted in him. He wasn't afraid. He was desperate. With a cry, he lunged forward, hoping to disarm Tommy in one final reckless move. But Tommy was faster. In a split second, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the night, and the thug leader collapsed to the ground, a pool of blood spreading quickly around him. Greg and Derek froze, their eyes locked on the fallen man. For a moment, there was no sound except the distant hum of traffic and the labored breathing of the three brothers. "Is it over?" Derek whispered, his voice shaking. He looked at the thugs still standing, but they were no longer rushing toward them. They had witnessed the death of their leader, and something in them had snapped. The fight had lost its purpose. Greg wiped the blood from his side, his face a mix of relief and disgust. I don't think it's over. Not yet. Tommy stood over the fallen thug, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his face hard as stone. It's over when we say it's over. They weren't safe yet. Even though the thug leader was down, the remaining thugs were still standing, but Tommy had just drawn the line. The Jenkins brothers were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. This fight wasn't just for survival anymore. It was a statement. We're not leaving until every last one of them is gone, Tommy said, his voice cold, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. The remaining thugs hesitated, but the damage had already been done. They had crossed the wrong people, and now they were paying the price. The battle for control of the streets was far from over. Tommy, Greg, and Derek knew this was just the beginning. The message had been sent loud and clear: mess with the Jenkins brothers, and you wouldn't live to tell the tale. The night felt heavy with the aftermath of violence. Blood soaked the cracked pavement where the thug leader had fallen, and the bodies of the remaining attackers were scattered like broken toys. The Jenkins brothers stood in the center of it all, their breath shallow and ragged. There was a sickening silence, the kind that follows a storm, a moment where everything slows down and the world finally catches up with the destruction. Tommy wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, feeling the sweat and blood mix. His heart raced, but there was no fear now, only a quiet determination. We need to finish this, he said, his voice low but firm. We don't walk away until it's done. Derek was still in shock. His hands trembled, his eyes darting between the fallen men around them. He had never seen death up close like this, certainly not in the way it had unfolded tonight. It was one thing to fight, to defend oneself, but it was something else entirely to end lives, to leave people in a heap on the street. The reality of it was settling on him, and he didn't know how to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside. Greg, older and more seasoned, looked at his brothers, his expression hard. Don't think about it, not yet. We deal with the aftermath later. Right now we finish what we started. He stepped over one of the thugs, his boots crunching over gravel, and reached for his gun. The tension in the air was palpable, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. He felt it in his gut. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about respect. This was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could walk over the Jenkins family and get away with it. A few of the remaining thugs were trying to regroup, their eyes wild, their hands shaking, but none of them made a move to run. They had witnessed what happened to their leader. They knew the brothers meant business. Tommy raised his pistol, eyeing the last few survivors. Last chance, he called out, his voice harsh. Walk away now, and you live. Stay, and you die. There was no hesitation in his words. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The power he felt now, standing over these men, was something he couldn't explain. But he knew one thing for sure. The streets of New York had a way of swallowing people whole, and tonight they had swallowed these thugs whole. The remaining men glanced at each other, fear in their eyes. There was no glory in this anymore, no pride, just a desperate attempt to survive. They were trapped, stuck in a corner with no escape. One of the thugs, the tallest and perhaps the most defiant, stepped forward. His face was bloodied, his lips split, but his eyes were full of defiance. You're gonna regret this, he spat. You think you can take over these streets? You're nothing. You're dead men walking. Tommy didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger once more, and the thug crumpled to the ground, a spray of blood marking his final words. Greg let out a long breath, his eyes scanning the area for any more threats. I told you they wouldn't back down. His tone was dry, almost resigned. It wasn't the first time he had been in a life-or-death situation, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just a gang fight. It was a battle for supremacy. Derek stood motionless, staring at the body of the thug who had fallen before him. His breath hitched, and for a moment he thought he might be sick. But he couldn't let himself show weakness. Not now. He looked at Tommy, who was still standing tall, a warrior in his element. Tommy's eyes locked onto Derek's. He saw the hesitation in his younger brother's face, the conflict brewing beneath the surface. We do what we have to do, Tommy said softly. We don't have the luxury of being soft. Not here. Not in this world. Derek nodded, but the weight of Tommy's words pressed down on him. He had always known that the streets weren't kind, that to survive, you had to be cold, calculated, willing to make choices others wouldn't. But the reality of it, the blood on his hands, the lives they had taken, it was something he hadn't fully prepared for. The three brothers moved quickly, their focus unwavering. There were no more words, no more questions, just action. They swept through the remaining thugs with ruthless precision, finishing what had started that night. By the time the sun started to rise, the streets were silent once more. The Jenkins brothers stood amidst the carnage, their bodies bruised and bloodied but alive. They had sent a message, one that would be whispered in the streets for years to come. No one would ever again dare to challenge the Jenkins family on these streets. But as the first light of dawn painted the city in hues of orange and red, a dark realization settled over Tommy. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The Jenkins brothers had made their mark, but in the world they inhabited, violence never truly ended. There would be consequences, and those consequences would be far-reaching. Greg slapped his brother on the back, breaking his thoughts. We did what we had to do, we survived, that's what matters. Tommy didn't respond immediately. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about the street code, the way things worked in their world, where respect was earned through blood and violence. And as much as he hated to admit it, a part of him wondered if they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We'll deal with that later, he muttered. Right now, we need to disappear before the cops show up. And just like that, they vanished into the streets, as shadows in the morning light, their fate uncertain, their legacy already written in blood. The city of New York, vast and indifferent, woke slowly that morning. The clang of subway cars, the hum of traffic, and the distant sound of voices in the street. Everything seemed ordinary, normal, like it always was. But to the Jenkins brothers, that normality was an illusion. Beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. What they had done the night before could not be hidden. The bloodshed, the violence, it would not go away so easily. Tommy, Greg, and Derek sat in a dimly lit diner on the edge of the city, their faces tired, their minds sharp. They hadn't said much since the fight. The adrenaline had worn off, and now they were left with the aftermath. It was a strange feeling, a gnawing sense that they had crossed a point of no return. But for the Jenkins brothers, there was no turning back. Greg was the first to break the silence. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and looked at Tommy. You think they'll come for us? Tommy leaned back in his seat, staring out the window at the rising sun. He was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. He had already felt the weight of what they'd done. The bodies, the faces, the names he wouldn't be able to forget. They'll come, the cops, the gangs, maybe even the feds, but it doesn't matter. We've made our mark, Greg. They know who we are now. Derek, who had been unusually quiet, stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. He looked up, his face pale, eyes wide. But we killed 12 people last night. 12. That's not something that just disappears. You can't just walk away from something like that. Tommy's gaze hardened. We didn't just kill 12 people, Derek. We killed 12 men who thought they could walk all over us, who thought they could take what was ours. He gestured around the diner. This is our world now. We survive by our own rules, no one else's. Greg chuckled darkly. That's all we ever did, Tommy. We've been living by our own rules since the day we walked into this city. But last night, that was different. That was a declaration. Derek looked from one brother to the other, trying to understand. A declaration of what? A declaration that we're not to be messed with, Tommy replied, his voice steady, but with a dangerous edge. We won't be pushed around anymore. We've made our choice, and we'll face whatever comes next. The bell above the diner door jingled, and the brothers instinctively tensed. A tall, well-dressed man walked in, his eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference. He moved like a predator, alert and calculating, and as soon as he spotted the Jenkins brothers, he made a beeline for their booth. He sat down across from them without waiting for an invitation, his sharp suit reflecting the dim light of the diner. "Well, well," he said, a smile creeping across his face. "The Jenkins brothers. I heard about what happened last night. You boys sure know how to make an entrance." Greg's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" The man's smile grew wider. "My name is Tony. I work for a certain someone who prefers to stay in the shadows. But trust me, we've been watching you. We know exactly who you are and what you're capable of." Tommy's eyes flickered with suspicion. "You have something to say, Tony?" "Actually," Tony leaned in, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "I do. You made a statement last night, but now you've caught the attention of people who don't take too kindly to someone taking matters into their own hands. You're in deeper than you think, and unless you want things to get messy, I'd suggest you listen to me very carefully." Tommy's fingers tightened around the edge of his cup. "Go on," he said, his voice cool, but there was a flicker of unease beneath his calm exterior. Tony's smile didn't waver. "You three are good at causing trouble, I'll give you that. But now you've attracted the attention of someone who doesn't play by your rules. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his name is Vincenzo Ferraro, and he doesn't take kindly to people disrupting his turf." The mention of Ferraro's name hit like a thunderclap in the quiet diner. Greg's eyes went wide, and Derek shifted uneasily in his seat. Ferraro was one of the most powerful men in New York, a shadowy figure whose influence stretched far beyond the city's streets. He was known for running one of the most feared criminal syndicates in the country, and he didn't tolerate challenges, especially not from newcomers. "Ferraro?" Greg repeated, disbelief in his voice. "You're telling us we pissed off Vincenzo Ferraro?" Tony nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And if you want to survive this, you need to start playing by his rules. Because right now you're just small-time players in a game that's way above your heads." Tommy's jaw clenched. He had been expecting something like this. He had known that their actions would not go unnoticed, but this was bigger than anything he had anticipated. Vincenzo Ferraro was untouchable, a force of nature, and anyone who went up against him usually ended up 6 feet under. "How do you suggest we play this game?" Tommy asked, his voice low, the weight of the situation sinking in. Tony leaned back, a smug expression on his face. "I'm here to offer you a chance, Jenkins. You get in line, you play nice with Ferraro, and we'll forget all about last night. You stay out of his way, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live long enough to see another day. But if you keep pushing, if you keep making waves, well, I think you know how this ends." Tommy's eyes bored into Tony's, his mind racing. The man was right. Ferraro wasn't someone you crossed without paying the price, but there was also a part of him that refused to back down, a part that felt the surge of pride from what they had done, what they had achieved. For the first time in their lives, they had commanded respect. And now, it seemed like it was all about to be ripped away from them. Tony finished his coffee, stood up, and flashed them one last smile. "You have a choice, Jenkins. Think about it carefully. You'll find me when you're ready to make the right decision." He walked out of the diner without a second glance, leaving the brothers in stunned silence. Greg was the first to speak. "What now?" Tommy didn't answer immediately. His mind was already working, calculating the next move. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power, respect, and their place in the city. And now, it seemed, the Jenkins brothers had a new challenge, to decide whether to bow to Ferraro or risk it all in a fight for their lives. The morning after Tony's visit, the air in the city felt different. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Tommy, Greg, and Derek sat in the small apartment they shared, the silence between them heavier than the air outside. Their lives, which had always been on the edge, were now on the brink of something far more dangerous. They had taken down 12 men in cold blood, and now they had to face the consequences. But what consequences would Ferraro bring? And more importantly, could they survive the fallout? Tommy sat at the table, turning his coffee cup between his hands, deep in thought. He had always been the leader of the group, the one who made the decisions, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of it all. Vincenzo Ferraro wasn't a man who forgave easily. The offer Tony made, to play nice and fall in line, was tempting. It meant survival, at least for now. But there was another part of Tommy, a stubborn, defiant part, that refused to bow down to anyone, especially not to a man like Ferraro. Greg broke the silence first, slamming his hand on the table. "What the hell do we do now, Tommy? We've got this Ferraro guy breathing down our necks, and you saw how he looked at us. He's not going to let this slide." Tommy looked up at his brother, meeting his gaze with a steely determination. "I know, Greg, but we don't just roll over for anyone. Ferraro thinks he can intimidate us, scare us into submission. He's wrong. But what if we're wrong?" Derek's voice trembled with fear. He had never been a fan of violence, never been as comfortable with it as Tommy and Greg. "We're not in control anymore. We're not running this show. Ferraro is, and we're just pawns in his game." Tommy stood up, pacing across the room. "We're not pawns. We're not anyone's second choice. We're the Jenkins brothers, and we've survived this long by playing our own game. We won't bend to Ferraro or anyone else." Greg and Derek exchanged glances. They could see the fire in Tommy's eyes, the same fire that had always driven them, the same fire that had led them into countless brawls and street fights. It was what had made them feared, what had earned them respect. But this time the stakes were different. "What are you saying, Tommy?" Greg asked slowly, his voice full of uncertainty. "I'm saying we don't make deals with the devil," Tommy replied, his voice cold. "We make our own fate. We take the fight to Ferraro, but we do it on our terms." Derek stepped back, shaking his head. "Are you crazy? Do you have any idea who Ferraro is? He's untouchable. If we go after him, we're dead." Tommy turned to face his brother, his eyes fierce. "I know exactly who Ferraro is. I've heard the stories, just like you. But I'm not going to let some guy in a suit tell me how to live my life. We've been running this city for years, Derek. It's time we make that clear." The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken fear and defiance. Tommy could see the doubt in his brother's eyes, but he knew they had no choice. They couldn't back down now, not after everything they had done, not after everything they had built. If they showed fear now, they might as well sign their own death warrant. "Look," Tommy continued, his voice calmer now, "we're not going to do this alone. We'll need allies. People who owe us. People who know how to fight. People who hate Ferraro as much as we do. We start by making sure he knows we're not afraid. We make our own rules, and we make him come to us." Greg nodded slowly, the resolve beginning to harden in his chest. He didn't like it, didn't want to go up against Ferraro, but he trusted Tommy. He had no choice but to follow his lead. "All right, Tommy, I'm in, but this isn't going to be easy." "I know," Tommy said, his voice full of quiet intensity. "But we don't have a choice. It's us or him, and I'll be damned if I let Ferraro take us down without a fight." The next few days were spent preparing for the inevitable showdown. Tommy reached out to old contacts, men he had known from the streets, from the bars, from the gritty underworld that had always been their home. Some were hesitant, others eager for the chance to strike back at Ferraro, a man who had made life in New York difficult for so many. Greg worked the phones, tracking down anyone who owed them favors or had a score to settle with Ferraro. Derek, though still nervous, couldn't help but feel the adrenaline begin to build. He didn't like violence, but he understood it. And when it came down to it, survival was all that mattered. By the end of the week, Tommy had a plan. It wasn't foolproof, but it was their best shot. They would draw Ferraro out, force him into the open where they could make their move. It was risky, dangerous, and it could easily turn into a bloodbath. But the Jenkins brothers weren't afraid of blood. They were afraid of losing everything they had fought for. On the night of the planned confrontation, they met at their usual spot, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could make their stand. The air was thick with tension as they waited for Ferraro's men to show up. Tommy looked at his brothers, each of them steeling themselves for what was to come. "This is it," he said quietly. "We fight for our lives. We fight for respect. We fight for everything we've earned. We don't back down." Greg and Derek nodded. There was no turning back now. As the night wore on, the sound of approaching cars broke the silence. The moment had arrived. They were about to face Ferraro's men, and Tommy knew that this would be a fight like no other. The sound of tires crunching over gravel echoed in the still night air as the first of Ferraro's cars arrived. Tommy stood at the entrance of the warehouse, his breath steady but his heart pounding. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. It was no longer about fighting for territory or respect on the streets. It was about survival. It was about proving that the Jenkins brothers weren't just some small-time players in a game too big for them. They were the ones who had made their mark on New York, and no one, not even a man like Ferraro, could erase that. Greg and Derek flanked him, their faces set with determination, but Tommy could see the nervous tension in their eyes. They had never been in a fight quite like this one. This wasn't just a street brawl. This wasn't some scuffle over a misunderstanding. This was war. War with one of the most dangerous men in the city. The door to the first car opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people step back, even in a place as grim as this warehouse. His face was cold, calculating, exactly the kind of man Ferraro would send. Tommy recognized him immediately. "Vinny," Tommy muttered under his breath. Vinny Rocco was one of Ferraro's most trusted enforcers, a man who had earned a reputation for being ruthless, methodical, and willing to do anything to please his boss. Behind Vinny, more cars pulled up, each one filled with men Tommy didn't recognize but knew instantly were Ferraro's soldiers. They were all the same, hard-faced, grim, and armed to the teeth. This wasn't just a negotiation. This was a fight to the death. Tommy turned to Greg and Derek. "Stay close," he ordered quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We don't let them surround us. We hold the line. If this goes south, we go down swinging." The three of them took their positions, Tommy and Greg at the front, Derek just behind them. They had come prepared, each of them carrying weapons hidden beneath their jackets. Tommy's was a custom-made handgun, sleek and deadly. Greg had a shotgun, perfect for close-range encounters, and Derek, still hesitant, had a knife, his weapon of choice when things got too personal. As the men stepped out of the cars, Vinny Rocco took the lead, striding toward the warehouse entrance with a confident, almost mocking smile. "Tommy Jenkins," he said, his voice low, tinged with disdain. "You and your brothers are in way over your heads. Ferraro said you'd show up, but I didn't expect this kind of spectacle." Tommy stood his ground, meeting Vinny's gaze. "We're not here for a spectacle. We're here for one thing, Vinny. Respect." Vinny laughed, the sound echoing off the cold concrete walls of the warehouse. "Respect? What do you know about respect? You kill a bunch of men and now you think you're some kind of big shot? Ferraro owns this city, Jenkins. You should have stayed in your lane." Tommy's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. "I've never stayed in anyone's lane, and I'm not about to start now. We're not bowing down to Ferraro. This city isn't his, and it sure as hell isn't yours. We've earned our place, and I'll be damned if you or anyone else takes it from us." At that moment, a soft click echoed in the stillness. Derek had pulled out his knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut through with a knife, and that's exactly what Derek was prepared to do. Vinny saw the movement and smirked. "So we're doing this the hard way, huh? All right then, let's see if you're as good as you think you are." Without another word, Vinny's men reached for their guns, their movement swift and practiced. Tommy's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. His hand moved to his gun, fingers curling around the handle, ready to draw. He had been in enough fights to know this was going to get ugly fast, but it wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about making sure Ferraro understood that the Jenkins brothers weren't just a stepping stone. They were the ones who ran the show. Greg stepped forward, the barrel of his shotgun aimed directly at one of Ferraro's men, a warning that was impossible to ignore. "Make one move," Greg said coldly, "and I swear we'll turn this whole place into a bloodbath." The standoff stretched out like an eternity. Every breath felt like an explosion in Tommy's chest, every second dragging on as if it could be their last. He could see the conflict in Vinny's eyes, the hesitation that came from knowing they were walking into a trap of their own making. But that hesitation didn't last long. "Do it!" Vinny snapped, and the order was enough to break the stillness. The first shot rang out, a deafening crack that sent the entire warehouse into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a blur of motion as both sides took cover. Tommy ducked behind a stack of crates, heart racing, the noise around him deafening. He could hear the thundering of his own pulse, feel the heat of the barrel of his gun as he aimed and fired, taking down one of Ferraro's men with a well-placed shot. Greg was already moving, his shotgun sending another body crashing to the ground. Derek, his face pale but determined, lunged at one of Ferraro's soldiers, driving his knife into the man's side with terrifying efficiency. There was no time to think, there was only time to act. Tommy's mind was clear, sharp, as he moved in and out of cover, firing his gun with deadly precision. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival, about proving to Ferraro and to everyone else that the Jenkins brothers weren't just a part of the game, they were the game. The fight raged on, the warehouse filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Tommy could hear the screams, the frantic orders, the clash of metal and bone, but his focus never wavered. He wasn't going to let Ferraro take them down. Not like this. Then, as quickly as it started, the shooting stopped. Silence descended over the warehouse like a thick, suffocating fog. Tommy's chest heaved, his gun still gripped tightly in his hand. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the bodies of Ferraro's men scattered across the floor. There were no more threats, except for Vinny Rocco. The enforcer was still standing, though barely, blood dripping from a wound in his side. He staggered forward, his face contorted in pain, but his eyes full of fury. "You think you won?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "Ferraro will—" Tommy cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Ferraro won't save you. You're not walking out of here." Vinny snarled, but Tommy didn't wait for him to speak again. He moved in quickly, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "Tell Ferraro," Tommy growled, "the Jenkins brothers don't bow to anyone. Not him, not you, not anybody." And with that, he left Vinny there bleeding and broken, to relay the message to Ferraro. The Jenkins brothers had survived the fight, but they knew this was far from over. They had made a statement tonight, but Ferraro wouldn't let it go so easily. The war had only just begun. The calm after the storm was unsettling. Tommy stood in the heart of the warehouse, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in his ears, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. His eyes scanned the wreckage. Bodies sprawled across the floor, some twitching in their final moments of life, others already lifeless. The smell of blood, sweat, and smoke was thick in the air, but it wasn't just the violence that made Tommy uneasy. It was the realization that this battle was only a small piece of the larger war. "We need to move," Greg said, his voice low, almost a whisper as he reloaded his shotgun. His face was streaked with blood, his hands trembling slightly despite the cold resolve in his eyes. "More of them will come. You know they will." Tommy nodded, his mind already racing ahead to what came next. "We've got one shot to finish this. Ferraro's not going to let us get away with this. He's going to make sure we pay." But Greg was right. They couldn't stay here. The warehouse was no longer a safe place. It was a symbol of their defiance, of the bloody price they were willing to pay for their survival. And now, it was a target. "We need to lay low," Derek spoke up, his voice sounding distant, as though he was speaking from another world. He was staring at the ground, his knife still gripped tightly in his hand, but his expression was one of exhaustion, not victory. "Get out of the city, at least for a while. We can't keep fighting like this." Tommy's mind raced. Derek was right. If they didn't disappear soon, Ferraro would hunt them down and he wouldn't stop until every last Jenkins brother was dead. But running wasn't an option for Tommy. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. "We're not running," Tommy said firmly. "We fight. But we do it on our terms. We send Ferraro a message he can't ignore." With that, the brothers began to prepare. There was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to be tracked down by Ferraro's men. The world outside the warehouse had already changed. Their family, their reputation, everything they'd built over the years was now on the line. Tommy's thoughts raced back to that fateful street fight that had sparked it all, the fight that had drawn the Jenkins brothers into Ferraro's web. They hadn't asked for this war, but they were in it now, and they weren't backing down. Greg and Derek moved quickly, gathering what supplies they could find. Extra ammunition, water, food, anything that would make their escape more manageable. Tommy, however, was preoccupied with something else. He wasn't ready to leave just yet. There was something unfinished here, a final piece to this puzzle that he had to put in place before they could walk away. "Let's go," Greg called, pulling Tommy from his thoughts. Tommy nodded, but hesitated for a moment longer. The warehouse doors were still ajar, the night air cool and heavy with the weight of the city's underbelly. He could hear the distant hum of the streets, the sirens, the sounds of New York continuing to move forward, unaware of the bloodshed that had taken place in the shadows. He had no illusions about what this city was capable of. It was a place where power and money ruled, where alliances were as fragile as the lives they were built on. But it was also a place where people fought for what was theirs, no matter the cost. They moved swiftly through the night, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the alleys and side streets. Tommy's mind remained focused, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Ferraro's men were ruthless, and they knew how to hunt. And that's exactly what they were doing now. As they made their way toward the car, Tommy's phone buzzed. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Ferraro had finally made his move. It was only a matter of time before he sent word, before the full weight of his empire came crashing down on them. But Tommy wasn't afraid. He was done running. He was done playing by Ferraro's rules. The car was parked a few blocks away, hidden beneath the shadows of a dilapidated building. It was old, beat up, but it had been their escape vehicle for the past few months. Now it was the key to their survival. As they piled in, Tommy's phone buzzed again, this time a message from an unknown number. "You've made your point, Jenkins, but now it's my turn." Tommy's eyes narrowed. The challenge was clear. Ferraro wasn't going to let them walk away. He was going to make them pay for every death, for every ounce of blood spilled. But Tommy wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to let Ferraro intimidate him or his brothers. They'd fought too hard to get this far. They'd taken down Ferraro's men, and now it was time to finish what they'd started. The car roared to life as they sped off into the night. Tommy's eyes were fixed ahead, but his thoughts were on one thing: Ferraro. The final showdown was coming. It was going to be bloody. It was going to be brutal. But it was going to end with one thing: the Jenkins brothers at the top where they belonged.